So for those of you who are coming on, I just want to say we're going to be waiting about another 2 minutes to begin as I see people starting to enter. Thank you. So let me begin and open this conference and thank everyone for joining. I see people are still joining, but I will begin to be respectful of everyone's time. My name is Barbara Beer. I'm the faculty director of the Multi-Regional Clinical Trials Center of Brigham and Women's Hospital and Harvard. And we are delighted to welcome you to the conference today, which is the first in a series of conferences on advancing international pediatric clinical research. This is really intentionally in the evening in the US to accommodate our colleagues in Asia and elsewhere, and in the American West, and then we're repeating the same topic tomorrow morning to accommodate the East Coast, Europe, Africa, and others. We're really thrilled that this has come together in the way that it has. And part of that is the series is supported by an FDA scientific conference grant, without which this would not have been possible. Could I have the next slide, please? So this is the disclaimer. I do want to say that anything that is said today, people say in their individual capacity, what they're not representing, unless they say so, the views of the US government, of Harvard University, of the Brigham and Women's Hospital, or other entities and organizations. We plan to host 5 virtual webinars. Each session is planned to be hosted twice with similar content and direction and topics, but with different speakers and panelists, in order to really allow for wide attendance and participation and different multinational points of view to be incorporated and to be thought about as we go forward together on thinking about this group of topics. This is an offshoot of the MRCT Center's project called Promoting Clinical Research in Children. Could I have the next slide, please? So the MRCT Center, for those who are new to us, we welcome you. We are a research and policy center at the Brigham and Harvard University, which really is dedicated to looking at the ethics, conduct, and international regulatory environment in multinational clinical trials, with the ultimate vision of improving the integrity, safety, and rigor of global clinical trials. Our mission is to really define emerging problems or known problems without a solution, and instead of simply redefining those problems, to really think about ethical, actionable, and solutions. And we do that work by bringing all stakeholders together, thinking that if we have pharma, patient advocates, academia, CROs, sites represented, regulators, journal editors, whomever is affected by the problem at hand, that it is more likely, any solution is more likely to be actionable and tractable with the populations affected. Could I have the next slide? So this work started in an effort to really think through issues in global pediatric research. And we focused on this because, of course, children deserve access to safe and effective medicines, but have been historically defined as a vulnerable population, as they are, but have been therefore excluded from or underrepresented in research. Pediatric populations are obviously widely dispersed, and the conditions that affect them children are often rare diseases, and therefore clinical trials must be conducted in multiple jurisdictions in order to be efficient and effective, and bring sort of generalizable knowledge into focus, in real time. There are persistent ethical issues which in doing research in children, and variation across the globe in terms of what those grounding ethical principles are and how to apply those principles in the real world. The regulations differ across the world. And as anybody who's done pediatric trials, there's real challenges in trial initiation and conduct. One of the things we've found over the course of working together has been a real appreciation of the voice of the parent and family and the patient themselves, the adolescent, the child. Often the voice and their opinion and engagement is not routinely solicited or included in the research, and we hope that we can begin with others to change that approach. So we started this project. Could I have the next slide? And we did this with leadership from Dr. Stephen Jaffe, who you'll hear from today, Lisa Koppelman, who has helped us throughout, Skip Nelson, Johnson & Johnson, and Dominic Karras at the European Medicines Agency, but really with the incredible work of about 80 members who represent all of the stakeholders, geographically diverse, and we met for approximately 90 minutes every month as a whole team, and then every week we met with a subgroup in order to really dig into issues, decision-making at the level of the child and family, benefit risk considerations at the level of the IRB or Research Ethics Committee, and then challenges of regulatory cooperation and operations. And out of this work came the themes that we are going to address in the series of conferences today and over the next year and a half. Could I have the next slide, please? So broadly speaking, we've been looking at the global landscape of pediatric research governance, focusing on legislative, regulatory, and guidance gaps, looking at current initiatives to improve pediatric research globally and identify those challenges related to decision-making on and behalf of the children. And then to think about benefit risk considerations in a transnational context and find meaningful ways to engage patients, families, and community members. And could I have the next slide? And of course, in the middle of this, we encountered COVID-19 and the pandemic, and initially the underappreciation of its impact on children, and later the appreciation of how important it is to consider children in this and to develop a research agenda and an understanding of the impact on children. And that is what we're going to be talking about today. And tomorrow morning, we're going to have two different keynote addresses. I will introduce the one in a minute and for tonight, and then talking about the time and initiation and conduct of clinical trials in children, using COVID-19 and our recent experience as a lens through which to look at this, and then to look at what kinds of infrastructure we need to sustain a development of a network for the conduct of ethical pediatric trials. Next, early in 2022, we'll be talking about the pediatric participant voice, and then talking about ethics committees, and then regulatory convergence. So I just want to mention that over the next 2 days, we have 4 continents represented in speakers: Asia, Africa, Europe, and North America. UK is part of Europe still. We have, I think, 10 countries, speakers from 10 countries, and we have participants from 6 continents. So we're delighted that this is actually a true global initiative. And I think while we suffer from virtual meetings, this does allow all of us to be together, at least virtually. Could I have the next slide? But it really gives me great pleasure today to introduce our keynote, Peter Marks, who is the director of the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research at the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. He obtained his MD and PhD at New York University and his internal medicine and hematology oncology training at the Brigham and Women's Hospital. And I think we've been friends now for 40 years, or 30, sorry, 30 years. He was the clinical director of hematology at Brigham and Women's Hospital. I'm also a hematologist, so I had the pleasure of interacting with him at the time. And then he left to go to Yale University to become the chief clinical officer of Smillo Cancer Hospital and the chief of the adult leukemia service. He joined the FDA about 10 years ago as the deputy director of CBER and became the director 5 years ago. It's been a great pleasure, and I want to say, Peter, thank you for your service. I know that nobody has worked harder, except perhaps for your other regulatory colleagues at the US FDA and at all other regulatory agencies across the world. It's been an amazing journey for this time. Peter will speak for probably 20 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions. Let me ask you to put the questions in the question and answer button, and we'll promote them for his consideration. So with that, Peter, all yours, and thank you again for joining us.
Thanks very much, Barbara. It's really a pleasure. So let me, I'm going to try to take you through some, I hope not to be too basic, but try to take us through kind of some of the considerations getting towards pediatric COVID-19 vaccines. If I have the next slide. I just want to start by saying that I know this may be like, why am I putting up? I've been seeing better photographs or illustrations of COVID and for COVID of SARS coronavirus 2 for a long time, people would probably say, but I just want to make the point that I'm going to be speaking about our US vaccines that are in relatively advanced development, all of which target the spike protein. But if we think on a global basis, inactivated, whole-killed, essentially, vaccines are used pretty broadly, and there are various ones around. Some of them are being given with adjuvants, and depending on what type of vaccine platform you're using, you will have a different level of comfort about that platform in pediatrics. Now, adjuvants bring up another issue, but if we have the next slide, our U.S. candidates, 5 of which had their development sponsored by the U.S. government, and 1 is been purchased in large part by the United States government. The Pfizer-BioNTech mRNA vaccine and the Moderna mRNA vaccines, both 2-dose regimens, that one of which is now approved for people 16 years and up, and is available for emergency use authorization for 12 through 15. That's the Pfizer-BioNTech. And then we have the Moderna, which is still just in 18 and up. So mRNA vaccines, just to point out that mRNA vaccines until this pandemic were never widely deployed. So in fact, we never had a licensed mRNA vaccine until recently. These were IND products being investigated for a number of infectious diseases, but not things that were being investigated in pediatrics extensively. Then we had the non-replicating viral vector vaccines, and the one that we have emergency use authorized in the United States is Janssen's vaccine based on the human adenovirus 26 platform. That platform was used for Janssen's Ebola virus vaccine, and that was given to a wide variety of individuals. Though not approved in the United States, has been overseas. And so the Janssen platform that it was used for the COVID-19 vaccine was not unfamiliar. And that obviously gives a little bit more familiarity with moving into pediatrics. The protein subunit vaccines from one by Novavax and the other by Sanofi have lagged somewhat in development. That has had to do, as public information has had to do in some cases, with the need to retool in terms of the candidates or some of the production issues. So their protein subunit vaccines, the reason why I mentioned those is that although a protein subunit for a COVID-19 vaccine is novel, we are very familiar with protein subunit vaccines for use in pediatrics, because many pediatric vaccines are such. Just one final thing, though, that goes with that. When you start to use novel adjuvants, that brings an additional level of complexity into this as we talk about pediatric vaccines, because the use of adjuvants often raises concerns, particularly novel adjuvants that have not been used widely before. And then the next slide, just to back up, though, of one of the complexities here is that normally when we license vaccines for children, or for anyone else for that matter, it's done under a biologics license application, which is basically something that we are able to do. It's actually was first granted, the authority was granted to the precursor to FDA, a precursor to FDA in 1903. Well, it was 1902, but they started in 1903 to issue licenses under what eventually became the Public Health Service Act. And that notes that the vaccines have to be safe, pure, and potent. And we generally consider evidence from adequate and well-controlled clinical trials before licensing a vaccine. Now, in the setting of this pandemic, if I have the next slide, we have made use rather extensively of our emergency use authorization authorities, which were put in place after the terrorist attacks of 9/11 to ensure that potentially life-saving medical products could be available to people in medical need when there wasn't an approved and available alternative. And the standard for here is relatively flexible. The product may be effective, and its known and potential benefits have to outweigh the known and potential risks. And FDA has given a fair amount of latitude to use this as a floor for what we authorize. It doesn't say that everything has to meet this minimum standard. It means that that's the minimum. It has to meet that minimum. I said that wrong. It has to meet that minimum, but doesn't say we can't have something where we are above that standard. And if I have the next slide, that is precisely what was done for preventative vaccines given to healthy individuals, and to ultimately to probably to healthy children, we hope, ultimately. we will use an emergency use authorization where we, in our guidance issued, which articulates how we will interpret our regulations, we said that we would authorize a vaccine for COVID-19 if there was clear and compelling efficacy in large, well-designed phase 3 clinical trials, that we would always have a careful evaluation of quality, safety, and efficacy. We would be transparent about how we did this by going to public advisory committee meetings, and that we would, for these vaccines, which tended to have less data up front in terms of safety data because of the duration of time that they were followed, we said we would have enhanced post-deployment surveillance. The actual efficacy data sets for these vaccines were actually quite robust, the size that they often would be for a clinical development program. But obviously, you couldn't speed up the safety. You can't get 6 months of safety data in fewer months. You have to wait the time. So that is the reason for the enhanced post-deployment surveillance. So if we go to the next slide, where did we land with this? Well, we're not going to require new randomized clinical trials in children. We're going to do what we do for other vaccines with immunobridge from adults for effectiveness. And this can be done as almost like bootstrapping, where in some cases you might immunobridge from to 16 and 17-year-olds from adults. Then you might bridge down to 12 to 15-year-olds. Then you might go to 5 to 11 or 6 to 11-year-olds, and then 2 to 5 or 6-year-olds, and then the youngest children. And obviously, as you go through this process, you're finding an appropriate dose for each of these age ranges, and then studying a sufficient number of individual children in these age ranges to feel comfortable with the safety profile, to be able to add that, in this case, to an emergency use authorization, or potentially, if this were an emergency use authorization, to a license. And on the next slide, this is how the bridging was done. The immunobridging approach that Pfizer took as an example here was to compare 12 to 15-year-olds to 16 to 25-year-olds who were vaccinated. You can see that in the clinical trial that they did, which involved was a placebo-controlled trial. They had a reasonable distribution across various ethnic groups. The distribution in 12 to 15-year-olds was perhaps not as good as it was in older individuals, and that's something we can obviously talk about in the pediatric age range. I'll go to the next slide. If one looks at the outcome from this trial, it was the typical immunobridging approach, where the immune response here in 12 to 15-year-olds was, if anything, somewhat better than in the 16 to 25-year-olds. We can say that met their non-inferiority criteria, and you can speculate that perhaps because 12 to 15-year-olds are on average smaller, or they may have more robust immune responses, or both of those, that was the reason for seeing these higher titers, given that the same dose was used for 12 to 15-year-olds as 16 to 25-year-olds. So in the next slide, just as an aside, they were actually able to look at efficacy because there was enough COVID-19 at this time, and showed that none of the 12 to 15-year-olds who received the vaccine got COVID-19, compared to 16 out of close to 1,000 individuals who received the placebo. So not super large, but still somewhat compelling ancillary evidence here. If we go to the next slide, importantly, in this case, we always are very concerned about safety data. And here you just can see that, compared to placebo, there are obviously more side effects with these, with the vaccine. But when you compare 12 to 15-year-olds to 16 to 25-year-olds, you're hard pressed to say that there's any difference in the spectrum of adverse events, at least in the clinical trial. Now, After deployment, we can talk about whether there will be a signal for myocarditis, which we're still looking at because that's clearly present in 16 to 25-year-olds, and it's still really not well defined yet in 12 to 15-year-olds. We're getting those data now. If I have the next slide. So just to kind of think through this, we have right now we have adolescents 12 years and older being dosed as adults under essentially under our emergency use authorization with one of the vaccines. And in the other vaccine trials that I'm aware of, they're also 12 and up are being the adult dose is being used at the moment. There may be some where they're using a lower dose, but for the ones that are leading right now, that's to my knowledge, that's the case. There are some special considerations, though, in children under 12 years, including the determination of the appropriate dose, the duration and number of children for safety follow-up. That obviously depends on what you expect to find, and obviously you want to have a robust enough data set. The other piece of this is that's a special consideration that I did not put here, is that in some cases one may need a special formulation because those of you may be familiar, the current dose that's given to adults with and individuals 12 and over of the Pfizer vaccine is 0.3 ml. A 0.1 ml dose is not really very feasible to administer, so you have to think about whether you're going to reformulate, and to wit, that's had to be done in some cases. And the trials are currently, some are completed, some are ongoing. We obviously have expecting data for one candidate imminently, and we will move rapidly to evaluate the data. But if I have the next slide, some real things that come out of this, at least for me, and it goes directly to your next panel, I believe. I didn't know it exactly at the time, but it does move in and slide very nicely in there. You know, pediatric development started in earnest following the emergency use authorization of the vaccines, but it actually didn't start in real earnest until a little while after. And was that the right timing? Could we have, I raise this as a question because as somebody who started very early on during the pandemic with involvement in thinking about how we could get ahead as fast as we could, yet with the safety and effectiveness information on vaccines that would make us confident in them, what was really the right timing? What would have been the right timing here? Should we have waited as we did? Could we have started those trials earlier once we saw a clear safety in the adult trials again, and was 2 months median follow-up enough, or should that have been longer? I'm not just asking here the question of whether development could have started sooner, immediately following the demonstration of effectiveness in phase 3, or even just immediately following our emergency use authorization. As I say, there was a gap of a number of months here, and some of that may have been because we didn't see children as the most pressing issue because they were getting less adverse effects from COVID-19. And so I would just put it to my mind that we really have to consider fully integrating pediatric countermeasure development into any future pandemic response plan, and thinking about when the right time would be to move forward. And that also may mean thinking about the right platforms to use in moving forward, because some platforms might be more acceptable to move forward with more rapidly in pediatrics than others. So I will stop there, and I really thank you for your attention.
This was really terrific, and thank you so much, Peter, for your thoughts and for that very brief history, a very short time. So let me encourage anybody who has questions to put them in the chat, in the Q&A, but I know that Steve Jaffe has a question because I saw his hand creep up in the middle of this. So Steve, go for it.
Great. Thank you, Barbara. And thank you, Peter, for that talk and for joining us. My hand actually popped up by mistake, but nonetheless, I will take advantage of the opportunity to ask a question. I wonder if, you raised on your last slide and in your last set of comments, the question of whether we could have moved faster once those adult data from November became available from Pfizer and BioNTech and then Moderna. And I wonder if you have sort of initial thoughts about specifically what steps might have been taken or how things might have been done differently to accelerate the timeline. Like what specifically could have been different, both in terms of the initial pediatric studies, which were the 12 to 15 group, really, I guess 12 to 17 with Moderna, but then at each subsequent sort of age tranche.
I mean, hindsight is always 20/20, but one question here is whether, even as we were working through the adult studies, whether we should have had the pediatric trials all written, ready to go, with sites ready to go, planning for success, given this was the pandemic of a scale it was. I think there was a lot of wishful thinking that maybe we would get this under control in adults and we wouldn't have to worry about the kids so much. There was, I think in reality, what we came to realize is this thing was bad. And I think to the extent that I think in the future, it's probably better to assume the worst. And then if we get surprised, it's easy to rip up a clinical trial protocol. I've deleted plenty protocols that I've written. Really easy. There's one button usually. Sometimes it asks if you really want to do so, but you can get rid of them easily. But it's not that hard to set up. It's not that hard to delete, but it can be pretty hard to set these things up and to think through a rational way of doing so and the most efficient way of doing so. And so I think we probably could have done so with a just in case scenario. Again, I'm not faulting anyone because in part I have to fault myself since I was involved in some of this, and I just want to think about how we could do it better. And so I think, yes, taking these things into account, also perhaps taking into account whether we, with that in mind, whether there would have been other vaccine platforms that we should have really tried to push forward more rapidly because they might be more acceptable to a pediatric population. Not totally sure about that, but I'm just, again, in the spirit of trying to speak honestly with things that you think about in the middle of the night. That's just what I would be saying.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hida, Dr. Nakamura has a question.
Okay. Timing. Well, for deciding the timing to start clinical trial depends on the information on safety and also on how sure you are about the dose. For this kind of vaccine, how early can you decide? Especially, this is a new type of vaccine, like a messenger RNA vaccine. And unless we know how we decide, it's very hard to discuss when to start.
Really good question. But I think one of the things we learned during this pandemic is that the number you put there for the dose, you can always come up with that after you get more information. But a lot of what takes a lot of time, at least in my experience over the years, what's taken a lot of time is getting people to agree on the design and getting people to find the sites and the execution of things. So I think what might have been possible is putting all those things in place such that by the time, by November, for both of the vaccines, we knew the adult dose, right? So we knew the upper limit, right, that would be coming downward from so we knew an effective dose in adults, right, at that point. And so you know you're going to come down from there potentially. So we didn't know where we'd be starting from. So you could have imagined that you had everything ready to go, and you moved directly to start those trials. Now, you'd have to say the big issue is, do you feel like you have enough safety data with the 2-month median follow-up that we had then to go into children, or at least start to work your way back from the oldest children into younger children. And one could say, well, maybe we just did it fine. It took a couple months and we got them started up and we got moving. But given the number of lives lost in this pandemic, I mean, some people get on my case because they wonder why we're pushing so hard sometimes to get things done a week or two earlier. But having spent some time with modelers at the beginning of the pandemic, a week turns into actual lives saved. So that's the reason why I just am constantly thinking about ways to be a little bit of an efficiency engineer here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So a couple of additional questions from the audience. One from AJ Allen. Now that we have more experience with mRNA vaccines, does that change the potential of those vaccines with peds in the future, i.e. the next pandemic? And how would you go about thinking about that?
Yeah, so I think I want to separate that into two pieces. First, I think the comment is, now that we have experience with a platform, we have 2 vaccines using that platform. I think that already makes, and we have data in children now starting to appear. And if those data turn out to be robust and we don't have safety concerns, I think the next time we'll feel confident. Now we have yet another platform, whether it be, now we have, we have adenoviral platforms, we have protein-based platforms, and now we can add that to our portfolio. It's not quite as robustly tested as protein-based vaccines or inactivated vaccines, but it's there. The other question, though, is how far will, I think one of the things I want to be careful about is there are some who say, great, mRNA, that's going to solve all the problems of the world and in infectious disease in the future. And I just want to, I don't mean to be a wet blanket, but what we've learned is that these vaccines are fit for purpose. And even though it's turned out that the mRNA vaccine, the combination of the mRNA and the lipid complex seems to do really beautiful against the respiratory virus, SARS coronavirus 2, it didn't do so well against certain other viruses. And conversely, a vaccine that did magnificently against Ebola, based on vesicular stomatitis virus, at least in a very good manufacturer's hands, they weren't really able to get it to make a good immune response against SARS coronavirus 2. So I think we're going to have, I just want to be careful that we don't over promise with the mRNA platform, because it really came through for us. I actually, from where I am broadcasting to you right now, I was on the other side of this table in November when I heard the results, and I actually nearly fainted. I asked like several times because it was pretty remarkable. So yes, it was great this time, but I think, and it's nice to have this as part of our armamentarium, but we'll have to see. I mean, the other nice thing about these mRNA vaccines is it is relatively easy when we have strain changes.
Yeah.
These will be easier strains or variant changes, a little easier than some of the others to deal with very rapidly.
Right, right. So is the FDA guiding manufacturers pre-trial to acceptable methodology and doses for younger children? In other words, ongoing 5 to 11, 6 months to 4 years old, et cetera, and how, there's an issue about sort of how proactive versus reactive is the FDA in this?
Now, I think we've tried to be reasonably proactive in discussions. We try to have a pretty vigorous dialogue with what's going on. In the pandemic, I think we've tried to have ongoing dialogue with all of the companies. Some may take what we say with more of a grain of salt than others, but I think the combination of FDA plus the fact for 5 out of these 6 vaccines, the government is sponsoring a fair amount of their development and has some say in how they go about their pediatric development plans, I think has helped ensure that it's being done in a reasonably rational manner. One could ask, could we put out better guidance in this area or more guidance in this area? And that'll be something to think about once this this pandemic is over. But we do have some guidance here, and we are trying to make sure we articulate that in reasonable ways to the developers.
So thank you. One last question that came up in the chat or in the question and answer, which is a bit provocative. Would you wish to start pediatric studies almost simultaneously? And if so, with what scenario would you envision?
With adults?
With adults? Yeah.
You know, look, I think that's a really provocative question. I guess what I always do when I get a question like this is I think about limiting theories. So let's think about what if we had a virus that started to circulate whereby we had it was like Ebola, but it was even more hard to, because it had the death rate that Ebola had with the asymptomatic carrier rate that SARS coronavirus 2 has. And so we started to have incredible challenges stopping outbreaks, and it was spreading really wildly and killing lots of children and adults. I think there you could make a very good case that, look, you probably work quickly to find a dose in adults, but you might not wait until the end of your effectiveness study in that setting. At least that's a thought I would have, because you know, there you have a very different benefit risk scenario, and I'm sure people could take issue with me at that, but it seems to me that there's, you know, that's the limiting aspect, but then I'm sure there's a lot of places in between that and influenza, right? And so where do you pick the right spot? And I'm glad that's why you guys are meeting, so that you can discuss this and tell us the right place to go.
Well, I think you've been absolutely spot on. You know, this was, the reaction is highly influenced by the impact on children of the disease itself. And therefore, to take this and try to generalize is insensitive to the quality of the condition that informs the analysis and therefore the right decision. So, you know, I'm not sure that we'll do any better, even if we discuss this all night long. But I have to say, you set us up for just a terrific set of discussions. I want to thank you again. I also want to thank you and your colleagues for working obviously 24/7, 365 for the last many months, years, and for the collaboration with your other fellow regulators around the world. I think the fact that that there was such sort of commonality and communication really helped us, and is something that we hope we see continue. And if anything we've heard today, it's that, you know, as a take-home message, we should think about having pediatrics front and center in the beginning, regardless of the impact on the kids, because we need to be thinking about that before we need to do anything about that, and be proactive and be prepared to rip up a piece of paper if we need to, but if not, to move forward with all haste and deliberateness. So once again, Peter, thank you so much for being here and for joining us to set the stage today.
Thanks very much. Thanks again.
Good. So I now have the pleasure, if we could have the next slide, of introducing the first panel, which is really a perfect follow-on from Dr. Marks's comments, which will be moderated by Stephen Jaffe of the University of Pennsylvania. And it's really going to be focused on the timing and, thinking about initiating clinical trials in children, spinning off from COVID-19 and what we can derive and think about from Peter's comments and the experience we've all undergone to sort of future pandemics, future diseases, future collaborative conditions. He'll be joined by Dr. Robert Frank of the Cincinnati Children's Hospital Medical Center, Dr. Calvin Ho from the University of Hong Kong in Hong Kong, and Dr. Xiao Mingyari from the Department of Pediatrics in Hamamatsu University School of Medicine in Japan. We're not going to spend the time today giving long introductory discussions of everybody's amazing qualifications. That is in your bio book, and we'll make sure you have it if you accessible. And with that, let me invite the panelists to come on and Dr. Jaffe to take over.
Great. Thank you, Barbara. And as you said, this really picks up sort of perfectly on Dr. Marks's remarks and the discussions that we had towards the end about timing. So let me, as we move into our panel, let me just say a few things to set the stage before I turn it over to the panelists. Next slide, please, Jen. So this is just as an example of what the timeline, one of the trials, obviously the US trials that was recently completed or is ongoing, but the primary results have been reported out, at least in adults, was the Pfizer-BioNTech trial. And this is what the timeline of that trial looks like between 2020, April when the trial started, and here where we are in October 2021. And the important point that I want to make here is that everything was done in a kind of sequential fashion, and maybe even as Dr. Marks was alluding to, with some gaps between the phases. So the first phase was the phase 1 and phase 2, very early sort of dose finding, early safety studies done only in adults, done between April and July. So it's at a 3-4 month period in 2020. Pfizer and BioNTech then opened their big registration pivotal phase 3 trial in July of 2020, and it continued at least till it reported out the primary findings. The data set was closed for that interim analysis that you all know about, that we then learned about in November. That occurred in October. Obviously, the safety part of the trial continues to this day. Do note that technically there were some kids included in this trial, at least by US definitions of children, because there were 16 and 17-year-olds included. So whatever the hurdles were to including at least some children were overcome by that one sponsor in that first trial, where at least older adolescents were included. The trial then added in 12 to 15-year-olds at the same dose, beginning in October. So after those primary efficacy and safety results were reported from the interim analysis, that continued through March of 2021. And only when that trial was completed and the results were reported from the point of view of both safety and efficacy, both immunologic and clinical efficacy, did the trial in younger children begin. And I wasn't able to find the breakdown of the dates. As Dr. Mark showed, they stepped it down from I think 5 to 11, and then 2 to 5, and then down to 6 months. And I wasn't able to find the dates for further breakdown. Next, please, Jen. So of course, there's a trade-off between speed and safety. And when I say safety, I'm thinking particularly safety for the people who participate in the trial, for the kids who participate in the trial. So things will go, if you move fast, the potential benefit of moving really quickly, doing the pediatric trials really quickly, is that you can get effective preventive and therapeutic interventions to children quickly, if in fact the intervention is safe and effective. Next slide, Jen. If the potential risk or downside of moving really quickly is that there's the chance that you will expose children in research to an unnecessary risk of harm. And that word unnecessary is important there. You're always exposing children in research to some risk of harm, at least when you're sort of putting biological or agents into their bodies. The point is, are you exposing them to an unnecessary risk of harm? Could you have done things to minimize that risk even further? And if you're moving very quickly, there's an increased chance that you will expose them to an unnecessary risk of harm. Next slide. On the other hand, if you move slowly, the risks or the I actually think I should have flipped these. Next, one more slide, Jen. So flip the two bottom boxes. The potential benefit of moving slowly is that you minimize the chance of exposing kids in research to the risk of harm. On the other hand, the potential risk is that it might take you longer than necessary to get effective preventive and therapeutic interventions to children. So there are pros and cons, benefits and risks to both the move slow and move fast approach. Next slide. Now, there are regulatory challenges that relate back to what I was talking about on the last few slides for beginning pediatric trials. And some of the specifics are going to vary depending upon the regulatory regime in a particular country or jurisdiction. But there are some general themes. One is that if you're going to do a pediatric trial, that trial must offer a prospect of benefit, at least if there's more than some very low threshold of risk. And so you must have data in hand from some source that allow you to say, yes, I believe that there's a prospect of benefit there. Next slide. Second, that prospect of benefit must justify the risk. And this actually relates to the very last bit of the conversation with Dr. Marks. The prospect of benefit is a function not only of how well the vaccine works, but also a function of the likelihood that kids are going to get sick. So if only a small proportion of kids in the population are going to get sick, that diminishes or attenuates the amount of potential for benefit. And also the severity of illness. So the fact that for the most part, SARS-CoV-2 or COVID-19 has not been a very severe illness in children, although that there are exceptions to that, and it may be changing with Delta. But that both of those facts attenuate the potential for benefit and make it more challenging to decide, yes, the prospect of benefit justify the risks of exposing kids to the vaccine. Next slide. And then, of course, one source of data that you really would like to be able to extrapolate from children is adult data. And the less adult data you have, the less you can be confident both that there's a prospect for benefit if you don't know about the adult efficacy, for example, and the amount of risk. You would like to ideally have adult safety data in order to be able to say, yes, we kept the risk down for children as much as possible. Next slide. There are also some practical challenges, setting aside that kind of regulatory criteria that must be met. So the one is the disease something that occurs in a similar way in both adults and children? If the disease seems to be pretty similar in adults and children, then you can assess efficacy in adults before studying in kids. But if either it's a uniquely pediatric disease or it sort of manifests differently between adults and children, then you may not actually be able to look to the adult data for efficacy. You can look to the adult data for safety. You can look to it for pharmacokinetics, maybe immunologic response in the case of a vaccine. But eventually, you're going to need to test it in kids without the benefit of adult efficacy data. Of course, with COVID-19, we did have adult efficacy data, but had things been very different and this been primarily a pediatric disease, we would not have had that. Next slide. The question of urgency. If a disease is a really big problem for kids, then there's urgency to moving forward as quickly as possible. On the other hand, if it's not a big problem, then studying the vaccine or the intervention in kids may be less urgent. And urgency is not just sort of a fact on the ground, but there's also perceptions of urgency. And I have the suspicion that because COVID-19 was so awful for adults and so awful for older adults, the perception of urgency for children may have been diminished, at least by comparison. Next slide. And then, again, picking up on Dr. Marks's remarks, just the practical logistical challenges of where are you going to run the trials, who's going to run them, the investigators with the expertise and the access to the patient or participant populations during the adult trials may not be the same people or institutions that have the expertise, the infrastructure, the access to be able to do the pediatric trials. So you may have to go to entirely new investigators and sites and look for different expertise. And that means setting up whole new systems if you haven't, if necessary, that are going to be different from the adult systems. Next slide. So you've already been introduced to our speakers in this order. So plan is for each of them to give us about 4 or 5 minutes worth of comments, and then we'll open things up for a discussion. And I will look forward to questions from all of you who are out there. So with that, last slide, turned over to Dr. Frank and Bob. Look forward to your comments.
So thank you, Steve. And so that first, I just wanted to say thank you to Barbara for giving me this opportunity. It's really very much of an honor to be able to be a part of this panel. And just as a background, so I kind of come with this at 2 different viewpoints. I'm a pediatric infectious disease physician, and I do clinical trials and vaccines. And I'm also the executive chair for our IRB at Cincinnati Children's Hospital. So like I said, have kind of 2 different ways of looking at this. And so, you know, as Dr. Jaffe has said, and that others, that the many of the products we use in children are tested in adults and then maybe move to children. I say maybe because, you know, we know that a lot of the products we use in children never have been officially tested in children. We use them off label with the idea that it's probably okay in kids because it's looked okay in adults. And that's risky because that may not be a right assumption. And one of the things I've seen through my experience as an IRB chair, I've seen this kind of practice change as far as, especially like with oncological trials, where when I was first coming to Cincinnati and as the IRB chair would be that pediatric, the trials in pediatrics for new oncological agents wouldn't even come to us until you finish the phase 3 trial and these drugs have already been started to be used in clinical practice. And that could be then maybe 4 or 5 or more years that delayed then for exposure in kids or potential help in kids. So what I've seen is that the oncology protocols now are moving to where after you have, oftentimes after the phase 1 data in the kids, in the adults, that you're moving into children fairly rapidly to try to provide the children access. Now, obviously, like Dr. Jaffe was saying, is that there's the downside of that is you could be exposing them to risk that may not be necessary. But in most of these cases, they're evaluating children that have no other therapeutic option. So the argument was that the risk was justified by the potential benefit. And so the one of the things that we see now with the COVID trials is that people were talking about is that, so I have been a PI for some of the COVID trials in adults and in children. And early on, as far as our involvement at Cincinnati Children's, we're one of the sites called the VTU, the Vaccine Treatment Evaluation Unit, which is an NIH-sponsored grant. And a number of us, none of our sites have PEDS ID docs at it. And we were concerned early on that there was an awful lot of attention, and very appropriately, being given to adults with COVID. But really, we felt like kids were getting a little bit of underrepresentation. And that really led us to write this editorial in the Clinical Infectious Diseases that got published last November about warp speed, why are pediatric vaccine trials stuck in neutral? And that because we really felt like we weren't getting things as fast as we would like to see them. And that because of that, the NIH actually assembled an ethics panel in August of last year and was talking about at that time saying that they thought there was sufficient data in August. So after, as Dr. Jaffe was showing, there 2 or 3 months of the safety data in the adults to even start pediatric trials at that time, but it did take a few more months, as he pointed out. And so we do think that our push did help a bit, but it was not quite as fast as we'd like. And, I think Dr. Marks and Dr. Jaffe and both brought up as far as like why might have taken that long. And I think some of it was just concern, nervousness. I mean, you don't want to do something harmful to the children. You want to make sure you're doing something, or as best you can, that's going to be beneficial. But one of the things I think with COVID, and I know we're talking about pediatric trials in general, but in COVID, is that while we worried a lot about the medical problems that adults had, and kids have had significant medical issues too, for the children, the social ramifications have been tremendous, as far as that people have likened COVID-19 to living through a class 5 hurricane. That the kids have been out of school, they have been socialized, they're missing their social activities, and that's so that there was a lot of other things where not only direct medical benefits that a vaccine could have helped them, and I think is helping them. And so that I think that right now, I think we're in a good place. I think the COVID though does allow us to have a framework to be able to look back at, is that say, is there something we should have done anything differently, could have done anything differently? And then going forward, how do we decide? And I think a lot of it is like Dr. Marks was saying, is that if you're talking about Ebola, where you have a 70% mortality, that's a lot different than if you're talking about something that has a very low mortality. So that where you start the clinical trials really can depend on, or should depend on, what kind of a disease you're dealing with. So that would be kind of my opening remarks, Steve, and that I'll be interested to hear our two colleagues and then what questions people have.
Terrific. Thanks so much, Dr. Frank. Let me turn it over now to Dr. Calvin Ho.
Thanks very much, Dr. Jaffe, and good seeing you. Hello, everyone. My name is Calvin. I'm well, speaking from Hong Kong. It's just sunrise here. So for some of you, that's essentially how tomorrow is going to be like, I suppose. So, so starting with this slide, I thought I'll just pick up on some points. I'm looking at or considering some of these issues from essentially an ethical and regulatory point of view. So to pick up on some of the points that Dr. Marks has earlier on mentioned, the situation here in Hong Kong and in other parts of East Asia would not be very different from the US. So there will be an ethical process involved. So the ethical process itself will be distinct from the regulatory process. And of course, in the context of this particular pandemic, there will be the emergency use authorization process that will need to be considered as well. But essentially, these various, if we think of them as safeguards, operate essentially at different levels of abstraction, although linked up in a few number of ways. So crucially, of course, they're concerned with ensuring that that proper consent is obtained. So consent, of course, in relation to children tends to be a bit more complicated because there's this notion of what's fair offer that's being made to parents involved in decision-making and what would be in the best interest of children to be involved in the trial. And in the context of this particular pandemic, it's the added complexity comes in determination of the favorable risk-benefit threshold. As Dr. Jaffe mentioned, that can be somewhat more complicated because of a number of pandemic-related conditions and uncertainties. I thought I'd just set out for the benefit of some of the audience not familiar with East Asia, the situation in Hong Kong and Singapore, which it's also quite similar to the situation on mainland China. So if I may have the next slide, please. Thank you. So looking first at Hong Kong, you'd see that the broad regulatory environment is set out in a particular ordinance and then supportive regulations as well. There is a centralized registration mechanism for clinical trials, which is different from the ethics process because that is decentralized in Hong Kong and also across mainland China. The concerns, again, are centralized around notions of consent, notions of best interest, but of course, the way that we consider consent, best interest, harms, benefits. So these will differ depending on whether it's through regulatory or otherwise ethical lenses. So happy to discuss more about that when we have the panel. So next slide, please. So in Singapore, broadly similar. So there would be a regulatory framework, essentially setting out a registration mechanism. So that is similarly centralized, but of course we have got a decentralized ethics process that will have to be observed as well in order to start clinical trials in Singapore. So similar to the situation in Hong Kong. Next slide, please. Thank you. So I thought it's helpful to look at this particular guidance issued by the Health Sciences Authority. Some of you may know that the Health Sciences Authority, or HSA in short, is the key regulator in Singapore. It has in this guidance set out, I think quite nicely in terms of a flow chart, some of the requirements that needs to be met. So next slide, please. So for example, if we think of the weighing up of risk and benefit, there are a number of considerations that's been set out schematically. That's in one of the diagrams, and in the other diagram, as you'd see, that relates to, of course, the consent process in relation to minors. There are some differences in terms of the age of majority. In Singapore, it's generally taken to be 21 years of age. In Hong Kong, it's prescribed in legislation as 18 years and above. So that would be the age of majority, or the adult age. Next slide, please. So, and if we think about safeguards within an emergency situation, such as the one we're in right now, so there are additional considerations. So these are meant to guide investigators as well as our IRB or REC colleagues think about some of the ethical implications concerned. Next slide, please. So if we think about this, the vaccination situation in Singapore, so it's currently offered to children above 12 years of age. There may be, depending on the trial data that's being produced, there may be a chance that that vaccination will also be initiated for children below the age of 12, probably between 3 to 12. But as I've mentioned, that will depend on data that's coming forward. As you see, the FDA is looked at quite carefully in terms of the decisions made by it. And that will affect regulatory processes or decisions in Singapore. Next slide, please. So similarly in Hong Kong, children above the age of 12 can be vaccinated, and similarly, depending on how the trial data comes forward, that vaccination may be extended to children below the age of 12. So currently just for children 12 years and above. Next slide, please. So for my final slide, just some considerations that I think we may want to take up in discussion. So as I've mentioned earlier and also mentioned by Dr. Jofi earlier, so there will be considerations of how to manage the uncertainties. It tends to be already quite challenging if we think about during peacetime, so to speak, involving children and getting parents to involve their children in clinical trials. And of course, given the uncertainties that we're met with in a pandemic situation, there are some hard decisions that will need to be made, some of which I think have already been pointed to at the start of this particular session. So there are quite a few questions in terms of clinical trial design. So something that Dr. Marks has mentioned earlier, well, happy to hear, like in other parts of the world, very difficult to get people to agree on what's the best research design. Of course, we have the scientific considerations, we have the ethical considerations, and we have the regulatory considerations. And getting all of them together will be challenging, and persuading parents to involve their children in trials, I think will be a further challenge, as many of us will know. There are ongoing questions about what will be the appropriate evidential threshold, especially within an endemic, a pandemic or an emergency use authorization kind of setting. So some questions which I hope we could take up in discussions later on. And with this, thank you so much for your attention. I look forward to the discussion.
Super. Thank you, Dr. Ho. Dr. Miari, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Steve. This is Isao Miari speaking from Japan. I'd like to thank Barbara for inviting me for this wonderful session. I'm a Peds ID doc who's been involved in clinical trials, and I'd like to go over our perspective from Japan. Next slide, please. Okay. Speaking in general, not related to COVID itself, but there's generally a drug lag before pediatric formularies reach Japan. This is one of the main issues, is that we don't have a pediatric study or a pediatric investigation plan that mandates that children be studied for new drug approvals in Japan, like you have in the United States or Europe. And number two, Japan is often not included in global clinical trials, including adults. So we generally lag behind in our pediatric formularies. So the graph here shows the percentage of the pediatric formularies that have been approved for each new drug that's been approved. And there have been efforts made, but just like Dr. Frank had mentioned, that many of the drugs are used off-label for pediatrics, and this is a major problem in Japan as well. Next slide, please. So speaking to COVID-19 and the vaccine, our situation is that clinicians were really caught by surprise when the COVID-19 vaccine suddenly became available to children 12 years and older in Japan. This was based on the special approval or emergency because we were not making our own vaccines at that point, and clinical trials were not being conducted. The general public was not very aware of how this process was going to go through. So for adults, what happened was in December, the COVID-19 vaccine was approved, and then it went through the submission through Pfizer, and it got approved in 2 months in Japan. After that, there was still, of course, a safety concern for this vaccine in our population. So the government decided to do a 100% follow-up and early phase vaccine campaign, and then the symptoms were monitored for the healthcare workers who got the vaccine early on, and then sort of developed a safety profile for the general. But for pediatrics, when the US FDA approved the vaccine for children in May, it was the lag time for approval for Japanese kids was just 3 weeks, and there was no specific survey for kids in Japan. So I think this timing actually was kind of took us by surprise. Next slide, please. So there was a lot of hesitancy among clinicians because there was not much communication between the government and the clinicians, and this kind of took us by surprise. And number two, because the race ethnicity of the Japanese children were not represented in this trial. Now, I think ultimately the timing of starting vaccines in Japan was actually appropriate from a practical point of view, because our kids, the Japanese children, there have been about 260,000 children patients that were infected under the age of 20 in Japan, and there have only been a few, less than 5 deaths in Japan at this point. So it's not affecting our children as much, but we didn't know that, actually didn't know that in the beginning. So I think but there was also a lot of anticipation and not knowing what would happen. So there's a need to involve multiple countries in pediatric clinical trials from the beginning, so we know what's going to happen. And there's also a need for coordination among regulatory bodies like FDA, EMA, and PMD, the Japanese FDA equivalent PMDA, to use common definitions and endpoints and drug approval to expedite global trials, and always room for better communication like we're having right now. So that's it for me. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you. I invite the other oh, great. Everybody's video is on. So invite questions and comments and discussion from folks in the audience. I have a few questions of my own while waiting for them to come in. Let me start. We talked a little bit about the requirements for beginning pediatric trials with respect to things like risk and benefit and those sorts of judgments in the United States. I mentioned that in my remarks. But I'm interested in Dr. Ho. I mean, you've got experience both with China, with Hong Kong, with mainland China, with Hong Kong, and with Singapore. The sort of additional criteria for beginning the pediatric trials in those countries and how they might, what criteria need to be met. And then Dr. Mario, I would ask you the same thing for Japan. So Dr. Ho, let me ask you to start with respect to what are some of the criteria that might be required to begin a pediatric trial in any of the countries that you're familiar with or that you worked in?
Thanks very much for the question, Dr. Jofi. So as far as I'm aware, there are no clinical trials involving children in Singapore or Hong Kong, but there are trials on mainland China, so as you know, so that in relation to the Sinopharm vaccine, as well as the Sinovac vaccine, Coronavac, that's used in Singapore as well as Hong Kong. So in terms of thinking about approval for trials, considerations, as I understand it, will not be very different from those in the US. So there will be considerations of the sort of risk that's posed to children in particular, and whether that is going to be benefit. Of course, the key question will be what we will take into account when we think about benefit. So one important consideration in East Asia will be the special relationship that we tend to find between children and grandparents. And as we know, older people tend to be a bit more susceptible to this particular disease. So that tends to weigh in quite strongly in thinking about what will ultimately be a best interest judgment and what will be an acceptable risk-benefit threshold. So that's one key element that has featured quite strongly in mainland China, particularly when the pandemic has been running in a very worrying way. The situation has somewhat changed now. So we do see ongoing trials, for example, in relation to another vaccine on mainland China, CanSino. So that relates more to mixing of different vaccines. So in that trial, there are children involved as well, and justification will be a bit different in the sense that we now have a better understanding of the effects that these vaccines could have, particularly on children. We know that they're generally safe when administered in children, but then we cannot rule out risk completely. So as we know, the side effects of myocarditis was not picked up in clinical trials, but only when vaccination was broadly introduced. So there are these sort of considerations, but by and large, I think there is a general understanding that taking holistically into account all the considerations pertaining to benefit, it was judged that, particularly at the point when the outbreak was ongoing, that there would be a clear benefit to children, particularly within a family setting, and regulatory approval as well as ethics approval were essentially granted on that basis. Thanks very much.
Thank you. And very interesting that sort of social and not strictly medical considerations may figure more prominently into decision making, whereas what I'm familiar with, at least in the United States, really focuses on purely medical benefits to kids in drug and therapeutic intervention trials. Dr. Miyari, can you speak to the Japanese situation?
Sure. As far as the regulations, the same ICH 11 and the revised ICH 11 applies to pediatric trials in Japan. So we have similar restrictions regarding age, weight, dose, form, ethical consideration as you do all over the world. Having said that, the barrier to bringing formularies into Japan is based on some regulatory and some social issues. So as far as the regulatory issue, I've sort of mentioned that we don't have the mandate to study pediatric populations when you bring in new drugs into Japan. So that is of course, disincentives for pharmaceutical companies to bring in and do clinical trials in Japan. And number two, from a social standpoint, I think there's much more, we are more conservative as the Japanese society may be a little more conservative compared to the United States as far as bringing in new medications, because for instance, with the COVID-19 vaccine, there was there's much more talk on the safety issues in the media and efficacy and what it might do. And even for the efficacy, there's a lot more talk about the breakthrough infections that have been occurring recently, instead of the fact that it's saving lots and lots of lives. So there's, I think, social background or people's perceptions that have to be weighed in to decide on whether trials will be conducted in Japan or not.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Dr. French, do you want to add anything? You've worked all over the world, although you're based now in the US and you run an IRB.
No, I mean, I think those are all really important points. You know, I had the opportunity to work in Egypt for 8 years, and there it was definitely a more conservative decision as far as that they wanted to have a lot of data in the adults before you'd ever would move into children. You know, I think one of the things, just as an aside though, is that one of the things that we have to remember though is, like Dr. Ho was mentioning about the myocarditis, is that no clinical trial is going to find those kind of rare side effects, and that, you know, the biggest trial we've ever had before this one, as far as for kids, is with rotavirus, and that with the 70,000 people that was done to try to look for intussusception. So, and that happened in 1 in 1,500. So that you needed huge numbers to find even something that's 1 in 1,500. So that is one of the things that we have to kind of accept for clinical trials, that we're gonna find things, or likely gonna find things that pop up as rare side effects that we don't ever identify during a clinical trial. And Dr. Miyari, is lucky for you. We had 250,000 cases last week alone in kids in the United States. So I'm happy to hear that you've had such a minor issue in Japan.
Let me ask I see a hand up among the attendees, and I'm not sure if that's left over from before or a new hand. Dr. Klein maybe, but while you're looking at that, let me ask all three of you for your thoughts. You know, the pediatric trials, at least the ones that I'm familiar with, have all included placebo arms that either randomized 1-to-1 or maybe 2-to-1 kids to vaccine versus kids to placebo. And I mean, I have not seen a lot of controversy about that. In other words, people arguing that maybe kids should not be exposed to placebos. But I'm interested in all of your thoughts about could and should these trials have been conducted without placebo controls in kids, or were the placebo controls sort of necessary and ethically appropriate? And I don't take any stand or position myself in posing that question. So maybe Dr. Frank, let me start with you, given that you've actually run some of these trials.
Yeah, I mean, you know, so that the data that Dr. Marks was showing, there was actually our study that was in the New England Journal about the pediatric vaccine trial for the Pfizer. And that, so one of the figures there is that if you looked at the percentage of kids that had headaches or the percentage of kids that had fatigue that were in the vaccine group versus the placebo group, it was, after dose one at least, it was almost identical. And so that a lot of these subjective complaints, not just for COVID, but really for any of the vaccine trials we do, we really think that you need to have placebos to get a good idea of what the safety profile is. Obviously, there has to be equipoise. I mean, you're not going to be doing something where you're going to give somebody a placebo and put them at extra risk. But at the initial clinical trials, we really didn't have anything else for the kids. So thought that as a treatment or preventative, so that the thought of placebo was worthwhile. And that the other thing too is that to really, for efficacy, you need to have a placebo, because otherwise you really don't know. If there's no disease, it could be just by chance is that there's no disease in the community, or your participants didn't get exposed to the disease, so that you don't know that they were protected, or it was just by luck that they didn't get infected. So that's what we thought the vaccines were needed to have a placebo. You know, one of the things, Steve, we talked about is that once you had an EUA, should you continue placebos at that point? Was it right to continue placebos then? And you know, people argued that it really was variable then. If you looked at the deaths from COVID, 90+% of the deaths from COVID were in 50-year-olds and above. And so some people are arguing, well, you could continue placebos in 18 to 49-year-olds because their risk of death was extremely low. So even within groups that in adults, there was a discussion of when to stop doing placebo-controlled trials. But from our standpoint, I really think it was important. Our IRB didn't have an issue with it, because we really didn't see that there was an option at that point. I mean, you know, some other potential treatment or preventative that was going to be equivalent to the vaccine.
Dr. Miari or Dr. Hope?
I'll start. So in the beginning, actually, after the adult studies came out, I didn't think that we actually needed a placebo arm for pediatrics, but actually we know that this was planned much beforehand. And also the fact that Dr. Frank mentioned that you know, even the placebo arm had headaches, and also although the numbers were very small, there was a 100% efficacy for the pediatric side, was really helpful in promoting the pediatric vaccines. So I guess to summarize, I think the placebo arm was needed, and it was very beneficial at this point.
Yeah. So thanks so much, Dr. Joffe, for raising the point. And I think Dr. Frank has set out the issues very nicely. So Frankly, I'm not sure what the situation is going to be like now, given that there have been approvals and eventually we will see full authorization of some of these vaccines, and so how we are to think about equipoise in that context. And if we do have an increasing number of vaccines that will become available, and I think it's going to be quite difficult to sustain, in a sense, the placebo arm, and also to get parents to consent to that. So given this, well, I'm generally quite interested to hear about what panel members would think about the way forward.
I guess I might say, having watched what happened with the adult trials, where again, I'm speaking about the US experience, once vaccines were authorized and available for a particular group, because even though they were authorized more broadly, they initially became available for older people, people at particularly high risk of occupational exposure or severe disease. And so people who met those categories who were in the trials were given the option to be unblinded, and then if they wished to then get the authorized vaccine outside of the trial. And as the sort of access in the country was expanded, people who became eligible for the vaccine outside the trial were given the option to be unblinded. And if that's the precedent, I think it will be difficult in the clinical trials not to give the kids and the families the options to be unblinded and to receive an authorized vaccine once it is available to them.
That, Steve, actually is exactly what we're going to be doing with the pediatric trials for Pfizer, as far as that the original protocol said at 6 months that you would unblind, but then there's a proviso in there if a vaccine would be available by EUA before then, that they would offer the vaccine. So just like you're saying.
I see Barbara Beerer has her hand up.
Yeah, I want to thank everyone for this wonderful conversation so far, and I really appreciate the cultural differences in terms of the sort of predilection of different communities to enter kids into trials, and that, of course, is balanced by the risk benefit of what the trial is itself. You know, if the kids were dying, and it probably wouldn't matter whether it's Japan, Hong Kong, or US. But so I understand that. I wonder if we could pivot to study design, which is something that you all, or 2 out of 3 of you brought up, and Dr. Marks brought up as well. Do you think that there are significant differences in how different groups would approach that study design issue? And could we come to a common approach for that, before it needs to go live? This idea of, could we be shovel ready, as it were, for a clinical trial appropriately?
Well, Barbara, I'll be brave as far as it. So we actually did, from the VTU, get a number of PED-ID physicians to get together and put together a shell protocol that we circulated to the companies and also to WHO and other different organizations to try to let them review, give their buy-in, and to do just that, as far as to try to have something that has been beaten up, hashed out, and that's so that and can be hopefully agreed upon by large groups, so that it is something that could be instituted fairly quickly.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody else want to respond to that question?
Well, just thank you so much for the question, and Dr. Vera, thank you so much for the invitation. I forget to say that to you and your team.
Oh, no, thank you. Thank
This
you for
great platform to have this discussion. Well, my sense is that in Hong Kong, parents tend to be very protective of children. So if we're faced with a condition, say, for example, COVID, that poses significant risk of harm to children in particular, and say, for example, we have a number of vaccine that has received authorization, whether it's emergency use or full, it will be very difficult to sustain the placebo arm because parents will be saying that there's no reason to prevent their children from having the sort of protection that they will need. So I think it goes towards question about thinking of what kind of standards we can sustain and what sort of guidance equipoise gives us in a sense. So when is a standard of care good enough that we're convinced that we can proceed without the placebo arm? And I think that's a question that we have been grappling with, particularly in thinking about how this pandemic is moving forward. So not quite a response to your question, I'm afraid, but it's certainly one of the very strong social conditions that we have encountered within our setting.
Yeah. And let me just comment. The way I'm thinking about it is, there's the social concerns about actually entering the children into a vaccine, which is very much based on the condition itself. But there's the planning, getting to a commonality of a study protocol and having that ready. And I'm not sure that this is going to be very, very different culturally or internationally. One thing that is very low-hanging fruit, in my opinion, or that we should be able to do, is to have common endpoints, common definitions, common data, so that we can at least use the data and compare it across at the end. But, of course, easy to say and hard to do.
Let me actually pick up on that last point. There's a question in the Q&A from Khalid Mohammed. I'll just read it. How do regulators look for the pathophysiology of the disease in children to decide what clinical outcome would be better for proving efficacy? Does the critically ill or hospitalization, or is the critical illness or hospitalization more important, or is the infection itself the major point? Because of the inclusion of the social impact on shutdown, my thinking is the effectiveness criteria would be different. So in the context of trials in children, what endpoint should we be looking for? And of course, in COVID-19, one of you can't ignore the fact that the severity of illness is relatively less in children than it is in adults. So what are your thoughts about endpoints? Perhaps Dr. Mary and Dr. Frank, I'll turn to you, given that you're both pediatric infectious disease doctors.
Okay, I'll start then. When our panel of experts met in pediatric infectious diseases in Japan, we tried to make our recommendations based on the physical impact of the disease itself and be balanced. When we actually looked at the actual data, it was hard to truly justify giving COVID vaccines to our pediatric patients. So we did sort of comment on the social impact that it has had on children and made our recommendations. But I think these issues are very important and but should be separated out so that people can make like informed decisions.
So that one of the things I think also is that it's been interesting is that the vaccine itself has had such phenomenal results that it's now almost to where people are having unrealistic expectations for the vaccine too, is that trying to remind people that coronavirus is a cold and that most of us have antibodies to 4 or 5 different coronaviruses that we've been exposed to our life. And COVID is a anomaly because none of us have been exposed to it. So, in that respect, that's one of the things now I'm trying to explain to people as far as that a breakthrough infection, if you will. Yeah, but are you in the ICU or did you die from the disease? And that's so, but along with the kids, I think one of the things is that we were thinking about, and I don't know, I'd be interested in Dr. Mia Iri, as far as in Japan, is that the children being fomites, if you will, or vectors, as far as that they're transmitting it to the adults. And, you know, one of the things that I never believed, as far as it, when this first started, people said, well, this is just an adult disease. It's not happening in kids. I said, oh, come on. That this is the only respiratory virus that I've ever seen then that doesn't affect children, and the children are more than happy to share with the rest of us. And so one of the other potentials with some of the things too, is that for a vaccine, I think, is that, like, so for flu, Ron Dagan has done some really great work in Israel to show that if you immunize the kids, you prevent older adults from getting flu. So that you can have an indirect benefit of the vaccine too, that can have a tremendous benefit for society. So in that respect, if the vaccine is well tolerated and you're having a good indirect effect, that may also justify reason to have a fairly widespread vaccination. But that, so, you know, that's kind of where we were at with the things. And that I think what we've seen in the United States, like I was saying, over the last, since August of when school's gone back in, is that the curve has just gone like this for the number of cases that we've had in kids. We had 250,000 one week, 260,000 the next week, 240 the week after that. So we had almost 1 million children in 4 weeks that got infected.
So speaking of that question, so when we did a survey of how kids were getting infected in Japan, we found that kids were getting infected from their parents. Like 70% of the kids that got infected got them from their parents or adults nearby. So we're finding out that kids were not serving as vectors as much as like similar to the influenza situation. So it was hard to justify giving vaccines to children from a public health standpoint, but for the benefit of the children themselves, it's important for them not to get infected so they don't have to go through quarantine or get removed from school. So that's how we sort of justified it. But now moving forward, now that most adults, like 60-70% of adults are have become vaccinated, and now it's going to be a kid's disease. It's hard. There's ongoing discussions about whether we should vaccinate our 5 to 11-year-olds from here. It's going to be a very tough question.
Great. Well, I see there's one more hand up in the Dr. Nakamura, but I think we actually have to transition to the break in a moment. So if it can be a very quick question or comment, and then we'll give people a break. We just have about 2 minutes.
Okay, I'll be short. In terms of regulators' decision, well, I once was a regulator in Japan too. It depends on how effective you think the drug is and what the most important endpoint is for the disease. I believe for Tamiflu, the endpoint was PQ admission. So, and for something like this vaccine, you know, you look at the antibody and also, you know, how many patients get sick and these issues. So it depends on, it's a balance between how effective the drug is and how important the impact of the treatment is. And it's not, that's not a decision by regulator. The regulators always discuss with investigators and clinicians to come to the best endpoint.
All right.
I wonder, before we close, if we could just ask, how do you know what the directionality of infection was from parents to kids rather than kids to parents? How did you determine that? But you can tell me in the break if you want to break.
So this was a survey done for all. So we asked the the pediatricians who were taking care of the kids, infected kids, and asked them whether there was a infection that preceded the kids' infections. And of course, at that point, it was not a simultaneous infection, but it was the parents who got them first, and then it was the kids. Of course, it was the kids and then the parents. It's very difficult to tease out, but other circumferential evidence, knowing that the parents got their infections from somewhere else outside. So we sort of determined that it was the parents who got the infection first, not the kids.
Assuming that the kids weren't symptomatic.
Right. Well, it's actually the parents were symptomatic and many of the kids were asymptomatic because they were tested based on the exposure.
Right. Thank you.
All right, great. Well, we are at the appointed hour. So I think now the plan, Barbara, is a 10-minute break and then people come back.
Absolutely. And we have a wonderful panel coming forward on infrastructure and creating the environment and preparedness. Thank you.
Right. Well, I want to thank you all for a terrific conversation and panel, and really appreciate all of your insights.
Yeah, and you can leave your video on and just turn it off for the 9 minutes, and then we'll come back to life. Thank you. So let me invite everyone back up. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce the second panel. And I am thrilled to say that we're going to now move on to discuss something that was touched on in the last panel, which is to say, presuming that we have a trial that we wish to conduct in pediatrics, and there is agreement on that, you know, in the direction, the study design, the age group, et cetera, we need a network of clinical trial sites, trained personnel, investigators, data coordination, et cetera, in order to somebody's telling me to turn my phone off, but it's coming through my computer, so I can't help that. Sorry. To help run those clinical trials at a time. And so thinking about what resources we need and how we go forward is one of the things that we're going to consider in the next panel. We are delighted to have this moderated by Alicia Croaker, Dr. Alicia Croaker, who is from Health Canada in Canada, and has been participating both on the planning committee and on the work group for many months. Dr. Colin Hovinga, who is from the Institute for Advanced Clinical Trials for Children at the University of Texas at Austin and the University of Texas at Austin. Dr. Mario Alanis, who is from the Center for Innovation in Regulatory Science in Mexico and previously at COFEPRIS in Mexico, and Dr. Hidefumi Nakamura from the National Center for Child Health and Development in Japan. And certainly if we have time, we have a guest speaker from Korea, Dr. Park, who will make comments as well if there's time at the end. Dr. Croaker.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. All right. Welcome, everyone. Good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever, depending on where you're joining us from. Welcome to the second panel, which Barbara just discussed. We'll be talking about infrastructure issues around pediatric clinical trials, how we can start addressing those issues both nationally and globally, and whether there are any lessons learned from the COVID-19 pandemic that we could adapt for pediatric trials. I'm truly honored to be able to moderate this panel for you today, especially with such esteemed colleagues on the webinar today. So as we all know, and we've heard about more today, there are a number of challenges that can complicate the conduct of pediatric clinical trials. Infrastructure issues for trials, especially pediatric trials, are felt globally, but I think as you'll hear from our panelists, the specifics differ across different jurisdictions. Canada, for example, I'm gonna, throw a little bit to Canada for a second. It's a geographically vast country with a relatively small population of just under 40 million people or so. And so this usually means that pediatric trials will need to be set up at multiple sites across Canada's 17 different pediatric hospitals from coast to coast. Traditionally, Canada's national funding structure hasn't been able to support clinical trial infrastructure because research tends to be provided on a project-by-project basis, meaning that for each new trial, all of its infrastructure would need to be reestablished, from personnel to office space and everything in between. So this lack of infrastructure support can really make it difficult to attract pediatric trials to Canada, and that can cause a significant burden also on everyone involved. That said, there does continue to be a healthy amount of pediatric research happening in Canada, and this is thanks in large part to established pediatric networks in Canada, such as MyCERN, for example, the Maternal, Infant, Child, and Youth Research Network that supports pediatric trials generally, C17, which supports pediatric oncology trials, and the Pediatric Emergency Room Consortium, or PERC, as well. Health Canada has recently developed a pediatric drug action plan, which we're now working on implementing to fill in any remaining gaps with updates to both our policies and our regulations, and we hope that this will support increased pediatric research and also availability then of therapeutics for all children. So I think something we've heard throughout the webinar today and in other sessions around COVID-19 as well is that this pandemic, as horrible and as devastating as it's been, has had a couple of silver linings. And I think firstly, it's really brought long existing health inequities sort of front and center and forced people to talk about them and develop new strategies to try to address them. So for example, this was the first time that I can recall ever where the general public cared about the diversity of the clinical trial population. It was in the news in Canada. I don't know if it was elsewhere, but it was in the news here. And then of course, not long after the adult studies, there's been a real public push to expedite the pediatric trials as much as is safely possible to make vaccines available to children. And this is in stark contrast to what generally happens for therapeutics that are approved in adults first. You know, there's not generally a public push to do the pediatric studies or even a public awareness that they need to be completed. And in fact, in many cases, as I'm sure you are all very acutely aware, these studies may only eventually be conducted due to requirements by regulators, which were put in place to try to address longstanding issues around access to medicines for pediatric patients. And I think secondly, the pandemic highlighted what's possible when we all come together globally to address an urgent health need. Over the last 18 months, there's been unprecedented international collaboration amongst academics and regulators and industry, increased dialogue between regulators and industry that really helped to accelerate development. And there was also a big increase in regulatory cooperation globally, resulting in harmonized approaches, aligned standards internationally, and certain agilities in both trial design and the conduct to support trials for COVID-19 therapies and vaccines. And I think it was because of this global collaboration, this global networking, if you will, that COVID therapies and vaccines were developed safely in record time. And then linking this to our discussion of pediatric development, we can't forget that many pediatric diseases are global emergencies too, even if they may be at a smaller scale. And many new or first ever therapies are needed urgently. And so sort of begs the question of what would the impact be if we were able to create a global network to address pediatric diseases, as was done for COVID-19, and how could that happen? And so today we have a panel of really excellent speakers who will share their ideas on how, and then also whether there may be additional lessons learned from the pandemic that could be applied to pediatric trials. And they'll also discuss the pediatric trial infrastructure realities within 3 different jurisdictions. So the US, Latin America, and Japan as well, including what mechanisms are in place to address any existing challenges. So without further ado, I would love to turn this over to our first speaker, Dr. Colin Havinga. Over to you. Thank you so much.
Sure. Today, I'm going to talk to you about the US perspective, some of the sentiments that have been echoed in previous discussions. I'm going to really focus on the network and the clinical practice sites perspective in my comments. I guess I will talk about infrastructure in the Q&A, but I wanted to talk about the goods, the bads, and uglies, and and how we handle COVID as clinical trial networks. So the first thing I want to sort of summarize is IACT is really, if you look at us, we're primarily in the US. We have 80 US sites, both inpatient, outpatient. And then we have a couple of sites in Latin America, and then we have a site in the Middle East, but we then have an enrichment of sites in Australia. So that sort of sets the foundation for where we're geographically located. Overall, I would say, the acute impact of COVID was sites' response was pretty heterogenic. I mean, it was a shock to the system. A lot of miscoordination of activities. IRBs really didn't know how to handle in many cases, reviews because of the risk benefit for cases of patients were unproven benefit in adults. And then you had patients that were asymptomatic or no symptoms that were beyond mild. And so generally, not a big challenge from a pediatric perspective at the time. There was a lot of undetermination from sponsors, sometimes even new sponsors that really hadn't done a lot of pediatric research, and trying to figure out how to extrapolate their adult trials and platforms and designs to the pediatric population. In many cases, this might have been even their first study. I know one of the challenges that we had in understanding landscape was even early feasibility. Use of real world data was really handicapped. Of course, there was CDC, but testing was really underdone in the US for quite some time. And then sites, didn't quite understand, how much to report and in the clinical space and particularly how it aligned to research. I think the last thing I'm really thinking about is that, the biggest impact I would think from a negative standpoint is this was a huge blow to the research infrastructure in the US. Many research departments shut down, and for many trials were halted or they're stopped. And there was quite a diversity in what criteria were used. In general, life-saving, or life, critical trials continued, like this, for example, oncology. And then sites would say that they would do COVID studies, but across the board, there was a lot of challenges. From the late landscape, I think what this has turned into, particularly in a lot of pediatric sites, is there's a bit of a slowness in this and responsive. I give you an example. I would say pre-COVID, if we sent out a feasibility questionnaire, we might get a 90% response rate. And sort of the early phase of COVID, that dropped off to 50%, and then it started dropping to less than 10%. Sites saying that we wouldn't take studies. That's gotten better, but it's not gotten back to baseline, so that there's still been some crippled elements to this. And I think that, the long lasting effect is that I think sites are a little more cautious about what they do. So getting consultants or getting sites to take new studies, there's a bit of pause because they don't know what's coming next. There's been a lot of work loss and turnover. Sites laid off research personnel, and just like clinical, nursing and other hospital personnel, people have just decided they don't want to do this anymore and do something else in another industry. And so I think that has been a significant concern. Now the positives, I think we've got to use a lot of tools that I think has been a long time coming. Things like remote monitoring, the use of telemedicine, creating the visits for that can be virtual, novel mechanisms for IP delivery and getting labs more locally, sort of more supporting decentralization in clinical trials. I think, including consenting processes, sites implemented a lot of fast track, review strategies for like contract budgets and IRBs to encourage, COVID studies to ramp more quickly, which I hope that we can take these lessons and begin to define them for other use cases to increase diversity. And obviously there's a lot of clinical diseases that might benefit from this because of minimizing the impact of quality of life of many, many families. I think one of the other big wins, and as being a network has been a really important notice, is that it really highlighted increased communication. Sponsors, regulatory agencies, and sites were all becoming more interactive to create novel solutions that would benefit patients for their participation in clinical trials. So I think it fostered a lot of problem solving to improve access to studies that can really, move forward in the current state of next step. Now, I want to contrast that. That's sort of the US perspective. Our feasibility outreaches to Australia, they really didn't have a lot of impact. Obviously, they were more social isolated. They didn't have numbers for patients because they just didn't have the geographic, exposure to COVID that the US had. And so, a lot of those discussions, were very, very different. So, it begs the question of, how do you include or involve or do research in one jurisdiction then to get it approved for a disease that might not be as prevalent in another space. That's all I have for comments in the in the part that about our response. I can pause my slides and go here, or how would you like it? We'll just go on to infrastructure. I'm good either way. Because I answered your question in the next slide. Go ahead. Okay. One of the things I want to emphasize is I think the building blocks are there. I think one of the things that this has taught us is institutional memory was probably going to be important to the next thing. Just like you give a vaccine, you know, you can think of COVID was a vaccine to the planet when it comes to network infrastructure. There are a lot of global networks. Some of these are represented in the calls the next day, and we have actually formed a lot of working groups and things to create more interoperability. I think there needs to be more visibility and cooperation with the broader diversity of sponsors. But I think that we're at the beginning steps of many of these networks creating, and there's a lot of activity going on here. I do think that there needs to be an overarching oversight of this so that there's better coordination and fostering of more strategic initiatives that go beyond one jurisdiction. But I think it all has the advantage of improving efficiencies and minimizing costs, and then preventing reinvention of the wheel. There's so much of what we do, and I think the core of these networks initially was to, of course, advance, you know, drugs approvals in children. But I think the challenge is that you have to do a lot of things with their own jurisdictions that are very similar. Ideally, we can build upon those lessons and create more interactions to minimize cost and improve efficiency. And I also think this has the advantage of a diversifying funding strategy. Next slide. Now, I think there's a lot of things that are going on in this space, and some of the other speakers may talk to this. I do think there are gaps in our global net that need to be filled. I think that's a key area. There are major jurisdictions that still need homes and collaborations, but we've got a good start. I think obviously there are activities in study feasibility and site selection, site standards, metrics and quality improvement, educational and training, and therapeutic area public meetings, all things that are shared amongst these networks. Some of them are very young networks, relatively, you know, as a whole. But again, they've accomplished quite a bit in the early times of their environment. And I think it's a testimony to the people that play well in the sandbox together to do this. And I think that this aids back to that institutional memory that needs to be for future pandemics. I also think this framework would be of critical importance to things like rare disease, where one jurisdiction is really not going to be able to meet the needs of this. And in many pediatric diseases, this is a common problem just because the adult sizes aren't there. I think our future state, there's discussions about how to do global, like basically one-stop shop where you come and you global experts to design trials. I think we need to think about real-world data and how it exists. Many of the networks have a PPI engagement. I think those strategies need to be, especially looking at the diversity and the cultural differences in each jurisdiction that need to be taken into account. There are activities in recruitment and retention, I think, that need to be better worked out and expanded. And then I think as a whole is really understanding the inventory of strengths and needs in the global community and not just focusing in one jurisdiction, because I think that that's been one of the limits of how we have done research in children, and that we don't reach out to the global community in an effective way. And I think that an overarching infrastructure really does need to have shared strategic goals and accountability. And I stress that accountability because I think if, you know, we really have to, you know, be fortuitous in what we use and the resources that we use, because the global population that's being served by this really, you know, needs to be served properly. And that's, I will close my comments, and I look forward to hearing commentary from the next speaker.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Havinga. Moving on now to our second speaker, Dr. Mario Alanis. Mario, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Alicia, for all the coordination of this panel. And I would like to thank Barbara and all the team for inviting me to participate here. I would like to briefly just comment about CIRS, the Center for Innovation and Regulatory Science. It's a not-for-profit center, more than 25 years. We have presence all over the world. I'm in particular focused in Latin America, regulatory strengthening, and I am very happy to share my thoughts in this issue. Next, please. As I said, I'm going to concentrate in Latin America, which is where I have more experience, but probably some of my comments will apply to other emerging countries or economies. In general, we observe a very low share of pediatric clinical trials, talking from a worldwide point of view, and much more so in the case of COVID, as you might suspect. And there are some issues in this fact that we have very low that have to do some with infrastructure that we will talk later. But now I would like just to mention that from a region point of view, it's a very advantageous in terms of cost and in terms of population diversity, ethnicity, etc. That could be very valuable in developing more clinical trials. However, one of the most important aspects is insufficient infrastructure. And that's, in general, we have some countries, some regions that have a little bit more developed. For example, the so-called regional reference countries, including Brazil, certainly Mexico, or to some extent Argentina, and Cuba have some areas that are more developed than the rest of Latin America, but still there are a lot of areas of opportunity. And in COVID, and particularly for pediatric, well, it was a missed opportunity, but as Dr. Marks, I think, was saying that there was a lack of planning because some of these clinical trials started much later. Well, even if there had been planning, probably some of these countries would not be included in the planning, largely because of this insufficient infrastructure that is very much needed. The next slide, please. And as all of you know, but I just wanted to outline some important aspects of infrastructure because it's very wide and it covers many things, and certainly it's not black and white, as I mentioned, and some countries or some regions have somewhat more development, but still there are opportunities in the scientific and methodological capacity, in the protocols design. There's a lot of areas of opportunity, and in data analysis, and there is a big need for more training. There is a big opportunity, but there's a big need to work with those. And most research is fragmented. There doesn't tend to be well-established networks of collaboration, and there is a need of funding. In spite of how valuable this kind of activity would be, there's still a lot of need and probably not good understanding. And in regulatory compliance, which is an area in which I have somewhat more experience because of what I have been dealing with agencies all of the region. As you all know, ICH is the Council for Harmonization, is the standard that most countries aim to comply for different areas of regulation, and particularly for clinical design and execution. And there is only one country in Latin America, for example, that is a member, which is Brazil. There are others which are observers, like Mexico and Colombia, and to some extent Argentina. These things have changed. However, they have not become members, and that, to start with, there is a good clinical trials guideline. It means that most likely they don't even comply with those good clinical trials. So to that extent, even having clinical trials in some of these countries might not be convenient if you are developing new medicines, because there is a risk that they might not comply with all the minimum regulatory compliance. Certainly, pharmacovigilance is developed to some extent, particularly in the countries I have mentioned, but pediatric, focus on pediatric is much less developed. And so in those sense, in terms of infrastructure, as a region, there is a lot of opportunity and there is a lot of need to develop in these areas. So when we talk about pediatric, is even more serious the need and the urgency to work in that sense in this region, in spite of having other big advantages. So that's when how there might be areas of opportunity to the benefit of the countries themselves, and in general for the development of new pediatrics and medicines and other therapeutics. Next, please. And given this situation, as I have mentioned, I believe there is a high potential, and given the population structure, which as a percentage compared to many other countries, there is a higher percentage of pediatric population, and as I mentioned, with different ethnicity. So there might be a big opportunity, but there has to be, on one hand, I believe, advocacy to develop awareness of the benefits, even the government and public institutions, which some of them are very rigorous, very serious, and very good professionals, but as a system in general, it has not been developed. When you read in the literature about some success cases, they talk about some like mentorship programs. It's like going hand by hand between either existing networks or existing centers, and make a partnership and basically go through the different aspects of infrastructure. It's normally not the buildings nor the capacity of the professionals, because there are some very good professionals, but some of other infrastructure that would be needed, and also the creating networks, because they tend to work very isolated. And certainly in regulation, for example, the minimum guidelines to enter to ICH include complying with good clinical practices. But the E11, I believe, which is for pediatric, is not a requirement, not even in tier 1 or tier 2. It's tier 3, which are all the other guidelines. So in that sense, I could risk to say that probably none of the Latin American regulatory agencies have implemented that, or to a very limited extent. So there is a need for an effort to expand agencies would welcome training, and there are interested parties that could help. And so I believe that is, if we are considering the title of this panel, sustaining or developing infrastructure, there is, I would think, a land of opportunity and that we could work on, and much more so in terms, certainly, of pediatric clinical trials. Thank you very much, Alicia, and I let the next speaker. Thank you.
That was excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Alanis. And Dr. Nakamura, over to you.
Thank you. Next slide, please. Okay. I'll talk about network activities in Japan. There are typically two networks, and I guess many of you know about American network, having represent IACT for children, and there's another network, Pediatric network, and in Europe there's a C4C, and that has, all these networks has much bigger funding. I'll explain what's going on in Japan. Next slide, please. Japan Pediatric Society, it's like a AAP, American Academy of Pediatrics. It's a Japanese counterpart. We have a Japan Pediatric Society Drug Development Network. So we're using JPS as a hub to give advice and consultation for industries. The original funding source was from AMED, Japan Agency for Medical Research and Development, from 2017 to 19, and now it's kind of stepped up, and now we are getting funding from the Ministry of Health, Labor and Welfare. And we have 17 working groups for consultation advice, and specialists from subspecialty society, and also clinical research coordinator. This is a Japanese term. It's more like research nurses, but in Japan, nurses, pharmacists both support clinical trials. So clinical research coordinators also join from Pediatric Clinical Trial Network. This is another network, and give advice from practical issues. And we are trying to expand the activity. So we're trying to add more working groups from different subspecialties. Next slide, please. This is the structure of JPS, JPEDNet. The main function is a Committee on Pharmaceutical Affairs that I'm chair of this committee right now. The final decision is made by Board of Directors, but Committee on Pharmaceutical Affairs plays a central role for this network. And there are currently 17 networks, and most likely there will be another network, anesthesiology working group, that will be established very soon. And during 2017 to 19, we have cumulative total of 62 specialists attended the activity from 13 for 13 medicines and indications. Next slide, please. So this is what we do. JPS stimulates active involvement of member clinicians in drug development, and we select what we think is the best specialists in Japan as working group members who can give advice on feasibility, better indications, schedule inclusion, and clinical criteria, and so on. So we give advice on protocol beforehand, and we can also recommend sites with good performance. If there's a request, specialists can also join the kickoff meeting of clinical trials and also join the PMDA consultation. And if we have to really recruit patients, the company really needs to recruit patients for rare diseases, we can disseminate information to all possible subspecialty societies through JPS. And we can also collaborate with other networks like Pediatric Cardiology Network, Pediatric Hematology Oncology Networks, and Pediatric Nephrology Networks. Next slide, please. So the network I explained is more of specialists giving advice and consultation. There's another network in Japan, Pediatric Clinical Trial Network Japan. And this is a network to conduct clinical trials. And they can, this network can conduct quick feasibility survey and site recommendation. And they are aiming for efficient conduct of clinical trials. And central ethics review is available for 39 institutions. And they have standardized cost calculation, and they have standardized certain procedures. And standardized informed consent and assent form is available. And now they are trying to make English translation of this assent form. And training and education, they have training and education program for research coordinators. The funding is partially from the Ministry of Health, Labor and Welfare, but they get fees from industries as well. So there are 55 institutions that cover 6,800 hospital beds, and this their office actually is across the corridor from my office. So we work very closely with this Pediatric Clinical Trial Network, and for JPEDNet, the annual funding is only $0.5 million worth a year. So it's much smaller than IACT or C4C. So we are trying to utilize the existing infrastructure, collaborate and connect the existing functions, and we are trying to support clinical trials for the better. And thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Nakamura. That was very, very interesting. All right, we actually have a last minute exciting addition to our speaker lineup for panel number 2. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Min-Soo Park, who is a professor in the Department of Pediatrics at Yonsei University College of Medicine, also the chair of Pharmaceutical Medicine and Regulatory Science. Also at Yonsei University, also the head of the Department of Neonatology at Severance Children's Hospital, and the head of the Department of Clinical Pharmacology at Severance Hospital. Dr. Park, thank you so much for being able to join us, and I will turn it over to you.
Oh, thank you, Alicia. I'm sorry that I haven't really prepared a formal presentation, and I was supposed to just give some comments on the situation in Korea. And it's good to hear our Hide speaking. We've met quite a long time ago, and because of the COVID, everything has been so much different. Well, in terms of the pediatric clinical trials, I don't know. I'm not quite sure I can be a representative for all the pediatric clinical research activities in Korea, but in terms of the research, researchers' effort, yes, we have similar structure to what Japan has, but not quite organized as in Japan. We don't really have the government support for those in pediatric society. But depending on the government grants for pediatric studies, usually stems from government's effort to try to solve the problems for off-label uses in pediatric population in Korea. They have been giving grants for pediatric studies for certain drugs and disease entities since 2010, and we've been able to do small scale pharmacokinetic studies in pediatric populations, as well as medium-sized clinical trials in pediatric populations in certain areas. Currently, I'm involved in a Ministry of Health, Ministry of Food and Drug Safety for the application of the extrapolation strategy that has been suggested for the extension of the indications in adult populations into pediatric populations. And we've been able to do a population pharmacokinetic studies in around 34 pediatric children between 2 and 6, where we found that we were able to extrapolate the efficacy data of the adult and as well as the older children between 7 and 15. So we were able to present that for actual government approval for indication extension it was in the area of the allergic rhinitis and the urticaria, but we still have some discrepancies in the part of those who try to solve the off-label uses in children, which department really supports the clinical trials in pediatric populations. But on the other hand, those that are in charge of responsible for the approval of these new indications in children, they're very reluctant to apply the actual strategy, the population pharmacokinetic data, based on pharmacokinetic data. They know that extrapolation strategy exists, but they're very reluctant. They haven't really had any experience approving this kind of indication extension based on the pharmacokinetic data only. And we are currently having much trouble actually dealing with the regulatory agencies. So basically what I'm trying to say is that yes, there are a lot of people who are eager to conduct a lot of studies, especially nowadays. Vaccine studies are coming from abroad, and global vaccine studies, not just COVID related, but other studies. But the regulatory agencies' stance is a little bit different. They are more cautious in terms of the new approaches that they haven't really been exposed to, and it's because of the responsibility that and probably they don't really want to be the first person to step forward. I'm not quite sure that there's a lot of fear involved in especially dealing with pediatric population. So this is a very small snapshot of a very small part of the clinical trial activities in pediatric populations in Korea.
All right, that was excellent. Thank you so much. You had excellent remarks for them being completely unprepared, and your surprise appearance here. So we really appreciate that. I think that that was excellent. Thank you. So now if I could ask all of the panelists to come on screen, we can start our discussion. We've got a couple of minutes left for that. And I see Barbara has the first question. Just a quick note to the audience, if you do have questions, please make sure that you put them in the Q&A function, and then we'll make sure that our wonderful panelists will be able to answer them. So thank you so much, Barbara, over to you.
Yeah, sure. So I wanted to thank the panelists and Dr. Park for joining us. What is so interesting is the commonality of experience depending on what lens you're looking at this problem through. For Mario, it's the lack of infrastructure, and for Dr. Park, it's the sort of lack of comfort on the regulatory side. So everybody has their own hesitation, and yet if we don't do model well-organized trials in children, then every child is an experiment. Now, I know everybody on this call knows that, but I wonder if you could sort of, pretend you're king for the day. What would you want to see in terms of a commitment to our, to our future, to our children, in this kind of either coordination, collaboration, infrastructure, besides money? We all know we need money. So, I just want to invite people to really think, what would change the current challenge?
Yeah, that's a great, excellent, deep question. Colin, it looks like you have come off of mute. Why don't you start?
Here we go. I think one of the hardest things in dealing, when I first started IACT, I think one of the hardest things was connectivity. I mean, we all are geographically isolated. We all live in very complicated landscapes, and finding someone who's completely across the planet, who's interested in the same stuff that you are, is oftentimes extremely challenging. I think is one of the things I think is the struggle point is that I think that, finding those silos to bring commonality and problems, because frankly, we work, some of us on this, and some of the networks work a lot together, but you don't understand the landscape unless you really have good conversations with these people, and it really drives change. And so one of the biggest barriers to that is, if I don't know you exist, I don't know what your problems are, I don't know how to tag team to fix them. And I think that that's what I would say is just that connectivity and things, so we can work together to solve those issues. And money is good. Money is also good. I'll put a plug in for money.
Yeah, money is the constant. All right, excellent. That's I think it's absolutely important. The connectivity, thus the global network being so important to help address some of these issues. Anyone else have a comment? Mario?
Yes, I think connectivity and collaboration is very important, not only within a country, because there are different cultures within a country, much more so internationally. However, I don't know if it's my bias, but I would tend to think that regulation would set a standard. And this is more like a central decision, because in every country there's like a central agency in charge of that. Once you have that, is easier, because then we would be talking pretty much the same language on how to do these things. So it's hard to single out one thing, because it's like most things, there are many, many factors, but I think collaboration deals with humans putting themselves together, which is very complicated, but then regulation might be relatively easier and set a common language. Yes, thank you.
Awesome, thank you so much. Dr. Nakamura, how about if you were king for the day, what would you change?
Well, I agree with Colin and Mario. Connectivity is very good. I've been talking to Colin and Mark Turner for better collaboration, but also I'm trying to push PMDA. Also, PMDA has an international relation department, but only they really know what's going on in the world, and not necessarily all the reviewers understand what's going on in the world. So I think, as Mario mentioned, well, PMDA and FDA collaborate and give educational course for APEC, and I think there are even attendants from South America. They give education course for reviewers, but at the regulatory level, I think we need them to understand better for these international issues as well.
Yeah, okay, excellent point. Dr. Park, anything to add?
Yeah, I echo with Peter and Dr. Mario. Yes, regulation. Probably PPCA, prayer regulations should be enforced in all the countries actually, and also probably the sharing of the experience with the US FDA and EMA with the officials in Korean ministry also would help, just like Japanese PMDA working with US FDA. I mentioned that they haven't really had a good experience or what to do, and that is one of the major hurdle. And also, there is another one that I feel very, that should be implemented worldwide. That is the increasing the awareness of the importance of participating in pediatric clinical trials. Parents are so selfish. I mean, they it can be done in other children, not mine. The same thing, right? So especially, I've mentioned that we've been participating in a number of vaccine-like trials. Especially, I'm in a neonatologist and doing a study for RSV prevention. Yes, the coverage by the national insurance program in Korea is so wide that they have taken up a lot of eligible patients that can be recruited as a participant. So because they are covered by the national insurance, there's less eagerness or need for parents to participate in certain trials that are not covered, and and probably because of the COVID. And I'm not quite sure, not because of COVID, but it was there all along. We had really difficult time recruiting allergic patients, etc. Growth hormone studies, etc. Yeah, I'm not quite sure. Is it different in Japan or in US or European countries that parents deal with these pediatric trials? What would be the difference? I mean, I would like to.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I think that's a really interesting comment, and I think you're right. I think it might differ across jurisdictions. I mean, you're always going to have parents who are worried for their children and might want someone to experiment on someone else's children. But I think there is also potentially in other jurisdictions the idea of doing research to protect children, as opposed to this idea of them being experimented on. And so, but maybe others here on the panel can speak to views on that in your jurisdictions. Dr. Nakamura?
Yeah, well, Japanese situation is very similar to Korea. Patient involvement, I think, is very important. Like, in European and American countries, there are more, child advocacy groups are involved in drug development. And in Japan, we're trying to set up a pilot advisory group. And I think it's also important to educate parents and children, healthy children, and about the importance of clinical trials, which we are kind of having difficulty, but I think education is very important.
Yes, I would just like, sorry, no.
Please, go ahead.
I just want to echo that, and I think we have seen, and I believe worldwide example, how bad communication can make people very scared about things with vaccines. But at least it's my perception worldwide, all this, and they are already authorized, emergency or something, and they, So more so if they don't understand what the risks are, and parents do need to understand what the risks are and what when they are being exposed to this, and it's certainly a challenge, I believe, yes.
Okay, perfect. And then let's do a response from Dr. Park, Dr. Havinga, and then
Yes.
there's one question that I do want to get to from the audience, and then I think that'll be time. So Dr. Park, over to you.
Yes, I would like to ask you for different jurisdictions. Do you have any formal educational programs for elementary school students or middle school or high school, whatever? I mean, I've been advocating for clinical trials over past 30 years, and I'm not quite sure. Once we educate the Congress people and mass media people, they grow up and they grow out of it. And new ones coming up, they are not educated at all, and we have to keep doing that. And the viewpoint of the people do not seem to change much. So how do you really expose general public to the importance of the conducting clinical trials, especially in children? I mean,
Sure, Dr. Havinga, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I mean, I do two plugs. One is MRCT has done an excellent job of creating endurable materials. I will. The other organization that I would point you to, and they do have international chapters. I happen to be on their educational committee. So, and Lisa Koppelman, who's at MRCT, who's also on that committee. They have a curriculum about that's built around children of different age groups. So it's level set, right? So they're different age groups. And they've done a lot of translation of content, explaining things about like placebo, what your research visit might look like, et cetera, et cetera. So, I would think that, reaching out to like Amy Omer or some of those, that might be a good venue to even consider starting chapters. Because I know HIDE, I think you have a chapter, and I know other parts of the globe have chapters with that organization as ways to serve in that. But that's all I have to say. Thank you.
I just wanted to say, I couldn't agree more. And I think that, COVID-19 was a opportunity to at least expose people to the value and sort of essential need of clinical trials to go forward with safety and efficacy. But I can tell you, we do not have education of medical students about how, clinical trials are conducted, nor about how drugs are developed. They think they fall from the sky, So I think this is really something that we as a scientific community committed to health literacy going forward should collaborate on going forward. And yes, we're working on materials, but I think it's a really excellent point.
Absolutely. All right, excellent. I know that we are running short of time. I think this will be a pretty quick question, Dr. Alanis, for you, just before we close up. From Dr. Klein, that says, you spoke of mentoring countries where there are differences in view. This is a good learning mechanism. How would you envisage doing that?
Well,
if you can answer quickly.
Yes, I would answer mentorship, like developing a strategic alliance at the highest level in two institutions, which one has to take the lead, look for who could be somewhere else, who's either linked to a university or something, and just go hand by hand and exchange people to be trained in both places so that they understand their culture and just be taken by the hand. I don't know if that is exactly what mentors, but that's how I understood it. Yes. Thank you.
Great, excellent. Thank you so much. So I just want to say before I pass things back to Barbara, a really, really big thank you so much to all of the panelists of panel 2, and I'll say thank you to panel 1 as well, because I can see you all here. It was a wonderful, really important conversation. And so I really, really appreciate you sharing your time and your expertise. Thank you so much. And Barbara, over to you.
Thank you. So let me extend my huge appreciation to all of you and to Lisa Koppelman and Jen Ewing and Walker Mora, who have helped put this together. I have to say, we started thinking about doing this conference when we realized that everyone was having, lessons learned from COVID. And you couldn't find pediatrics even in small letters anywhere on the, in the sort of presentation. And part of that, I think, is the accident that in this disease, unlike others, kids appeared to be less impacted early on. But I think we needed to attend to that early on when we had the time to really coordinate in a way that we should learn for next time. There will be a next time. And what I think we've seen in terms of having representatives from now 7 countries speaking today, I think, or 8, is the sort of the weight of whatever barrier or challenge is may differ, but we all share those challenges in getting these trials organized, conducted, and then the public understanding of how to proceed. And the more that we can do that together, and the more we can think about that in times of quiet, the better we'll be, prepared going forward. I do think that, while we can talk about preparedness, we do need, in windows of opportunity, to create that infrastructure and sort of the architecture of the communication so that when we need to deploy it, we can. And the only way to do that is to have ongoing trials of things that are non-critical or critical, but opportunities to keep us coordinated, alive, and working together in a different way going forward. And I think that we've really learned a tremendous amount today. We're going to have another session with same topics, completely different speakers, completely different countries tomorrow. And then I hope that we'll all work together to come up with sort of a synthesis for where we think this should go and what we learned through the sharing of an experience or sharing the experiences of COVID-19 to be better prepared going forward. And with that, I want to really thank everyone and thank the participants for joining us, and look forward to continuing to work together.
Thank you.
Thank you.